Hello, and welcome to Instructional Design and E-Learning. In this presentation, I hope to cover with you some basic principles of e-learning, and particularly instructional design, and mostly the Addie method. I hope you'll find it useful, and thank you for joining me. At the end of the presentation, please go to a link to my website where you'll get an opportunity to be able to participate in a free class I put together to help beginning instructors and also veterans with some of their instructional design needs. I'm Borcoman. Again, thank you.
Let's strike for a definition of instructional design. What it does is blend information, what we know about those students and people that are involved in a course, such as, for example, the learners. It incorporates ideas about the subject matter, concepts and theories about how people learn, and also we want to include what we understand to be the capabilities of the instructional medium that we have selected. And of course, for purposes of this presentation, we have selected technology and web-based delivery systems. Ideally, what we wish to do is to produce instruction that will facilitate learning, that will eventuate in a knowledge increase on the parts of our students. This particular graphic is intending to depict the relationship that exists between and amongst the basic components of a course, particularly an online course. Obviously, a very important component is the student. Another one, content. The instructor facilitator. The technology that's utilized in order to be able to produce what we call the deliverables. And this, of course, all takes place within the context of a classroom. And at least according to the conception that I propose to advance, these various components intermingle and mesh with each other. And there's a degree to which, in so doing, they produce a kind of systemic overall view of what in fact takes place in a classroom environment. Another way of putting it is kind of an egalitarian relationship that exists between and amongst the four components that are involved in the classroom in such a fashion that they, if you will, synergize in order to produce the result that we're after, and that is a healthy classroom environment in which the learner has actually accomplished the objectives that have been set. To expand just a bit, the content includes that which is to be taught, of course, including the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes that are to be generated within the learner to some extent. The instructor facilitator is the individual who organizes the subject matter in order to facilitate learning. And of course, in this particular situation, since this presentation is designed to help people deliver their online courses and organize their materials for that delivery, we're talking about all of these things that we've been discussing taking place in a virtual classroom environment using some learning management system like Blackboard, WebCT, Vista, Moodle, and one or the other of the many ones that are out there at this time. And the technology, trying to make the best use of the learning management system that is being incorporated. How much tech should be in a course online? What kind of video should be included? Will you be using computer-based teaching? I think personally it's very important to put video presentations in your class that are meaningful and very much related to the subject matter. And as we proceed in our little presentation here, we'll discover the manner in which instructional design is supposed to help all of us do just that. Select learning objects that are relevant and meaningful to the overall course, and paying due heed to the student learning outcomes that have been established for the subject matter. Probably all of us know what technology actually is, but let's take a little bit of a look at a kind of philosophical conceptualization of it. Technology, by definition, is that which extends our human capabilities. Things such as the lever, the wheel, chalkboards, books, videos, computers, learning management systems, perhaps even iPads, iPods, tablets, readers. All of this extends our human capabilities. At some point in time, I'm sure it'll be very profitable to have a discussion about whether or not all of the things that I've mentioned and some of the things that probably you've encountered, that you utilize and your students utilize, actually do help the learning process. But technically speaking, what we want to do is to utilize our technology for instructional purposes, to utilize the hardware, and develop a process that enhances and extends teaching and learning. And it turns out that there are many important and valuable ways to do this by using an online courseware management system, such as, for example, Blackboard. Typically, we look upon the instructional design process as a systems approach. And it is just as typically expressed as a linear model, what we call an iterative process. And usually, the instructional design methodology results in a set of real-world procedures. What that means is that we are trying to link up, generally speaking, with modern-day instructional design, what a student learns with some kind of a skill, a competency that can be applied to real-life scenarios. I think that this is just as true of some of the disciplines that perhaps seem to be a little bit more academic in nature, such as history or perhaps even philosophy. In a typical philosophy class that I teach, I often try to get my students to see how they're able to apply concepts to what is occurring in their daily lives, and I try to write that into the student learning outcomes for the course. A system does have four basic parts, generally speaking: input, processing, output, and feedback. Now, this may seem to be a kind of a cybernetic approach. There are different instructional design models that are not quite as rigid as this one may seem. Consequently, when you think about cognitive psychology and the cybernetic model, and you might think, well, perhaps it seems to be just a wee bit more frigid or rigid than I, as an instructor, care to think of the learning process as being. There are other ways of approaching your class that can be based upon the subject matter, and your own efforts at trying to create a meaningful experience can be modified and streamlined in order to accommodate your own teaching style. I like to think of a virtual classroom as an ecosystem, but I don't see why some of this wouldn't apply to a face-to-face environment. Based upon the model that we just discussed, there are certainly multiple inputs in an ecosystemic classroom. There is a technological environment. This could include the LMS that you're using, the video materials, perhaps what it is that you're requiring your students to do in a way of utilizing technology, such as, for example, making their own videos or making their own podcasts. The number of students, of course, is extremely important. Ability levels of the students, the requirements of the curriculum, the resources that one has that are available. And of course, as we progress, and you involve yourself in a little course that I've put up that's free, we will see just exactly how robust those teaching resources can be, and many of which are virtually cost-free to you, the instructor, for utilization in your online setting. There is the input of expectation, not only on the part of you, the facilitator of your course, but also the expectations of the students. And to a large extent, and I think particularly with reference to the online learning environment, what is your skill? What is your knowledge? Certainly of the subject matter, you may be regarded indeed as an expert. What is your skill and knowledge and comfort level with the use of certain kinds of technologies? That input, as we're referring to it here, has to be considered in any assessment as we start out with the instructional design process. Speaking of which, the instructional design process is a planning and an organizational tool. And the steps that are offered in that process try to help us ensure that the important information is considered in the context of our instructional problem or our challenge that we're trying to face as we actually develop and present our course. The very famous instructional design process is referred to by the nice and friendly name Addie. And what that stands for is analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. Here is a graphic representation of Addie. And to some extent you can determine that there's a kind of a flow that goes from the stages of analysis to design, to development, to implementation, and thus to evaluation. And generally speaking, in the Addie process, this is a iterative cycle. This continues on and on and on throughout the course, or perhaps at the end of the semester, as you are summing up or reevaluating what actually occurred, what worked, what didn't work. The Addie process is extremely helpful. Now, admittedly, it does seem, I suppose, perhaps a little bit, although circular here, step by step and linear, but in my own personal experience, and I think that I can probably vouch for the experience of others that happen to have been in this field at some point in time, you don't always proceed from step 1 to step 2. Sometimes you can bypass something, and also what happens is when you're doing course development, it could be that you're simply taking a course that you have had the opportunity to teach in a face-to-face environment for several semesters, and now you've been asked to import it or map it onto a virtual classroom. So the course is already developed, and it could be that the student learning outcomes that you have already don't need to be adjusted, but probably one of the main things that you're going to be taking a look at is how to design the course with respect to the technology, with respect to what we were talking about with regard to the ecosystem or the ecology of learning. Generally speaking, in a face-to-face classroom, you're there in an environment in which you take rule, you do attendance, you see your students, you interact with them, and if anything, the medium is a place-based environment. Generally speaking, you have walls, chalkboard, LCD projector. Some of the things, obviously, you're not going to be using. You're not going to be using a chalkboard, which is not to say that chalkboard is a bad thing to have. Some of my best teaching experiences and learning experiences have been as a function of the medium of a chalkboard. At the same time, we can have a virtual chalkboard. You can use things like Collaborate, and also some of the fun and wonderful web-based presentation programs, not unlike the one you're watching right now. In fact, if you use something like Camtasia, which happens to be the platform and the application I'm using at this point in time, you can embed little quizzes and interactive moments that actually help the student, the participant, seize upon the knowledge and learn it a little bit more. So there are ways of adapting the technology in a virtual environment to suit your needs as an instructor, and to some extent to map on what you have experienced in your face-to-face course into an online setting. Let's go into a little bit more detail about each of these steps. In the analysis phase, you take a look at your needs, and take a look at how it is that the course can in fact be conducted. Who is your target audience? What kind of content do you have? What kind of tasks are you going to be promoting for your students? In the design process, this is where, in all likelihood, the student learning outcomes, as they're often known, come into play. And you want to determine to what extent you want your students to be able to experience and understand and assimilate certain kinds of information. What are those outcomes? What do you expect of your students? Those must be made, by the way, extremely clear in an online setting. What kind of knowledge, skills, behaviors do you want your students to possess, ideally? How are you going to be able to evaluate them? What is the scope and the sequencing of the instructional events, and what kind of media are you going to be using? This is where I propose to be able to provide some assistance to all of those who want to really get more deeply involved in making their class a richer, more, as we say, robust experience for you and your students. Take a look at how to design not only your course, but how to take that design and integrate it into the manner in which your course is actually conducted and presented in an online environment. What I normally do is, when I sit down with somebody and we go through the design process, is to try to get them online immediately and take a look at their course structure. With your learning management system, you can actually design the navigation pane so that it leads to the content and the areas in which you want your students to take assessments, and the areas of the course where you want them to go in order to get certain kinds of media, such as videos from YouTube, slide presentations, and possibly even simulations. Now, I have to say that the textbook publishers, such as Wadsworth, Cengage, McGraw-Hill, many others, just to mention a few, have done a very good job in many instances in attempting to integrate textbook materials in a more or less seamless fashion with the learning management system of your choice. But even if it's not so much integrated, many of these publishers now have fairly complete websites. Sometimes they're called companion websites that students can log into. You'll just have to be kind of careful about whether or not there's some kind of a surcharge or an added fee. We all don't want our students spending an inordinate amount of money, and certainly we should be able to provide them with the kinds of resources that are going to be relatively cost effective, both to your students and to you as the instructor. In the development phase, we talk about things such as timelines, how we're going to manage the course. What kind of resources do we need? And of course, some of it, when we're talking about in the Addie process, prototype development, beta testing, usability testing, this all has that very heavy-duty systems look, and it doesn't often get implemented, but it is certainly something to pay attention to. If you're embarking for your first time in a new semester with a course that perhaps is either new to you or one that you've done before but now has been placed into an online format, you should bear in mind that that probably can be looked upon as a prototypical course, at least for you. And so what's very important is to evaluate the procedures and the successes or lack thereof, perhaps, that you might have had. But your success rate is going to be much higher if you have a fairly conscious and conscientious idea about just exactly what the processes are that are involved in developing and implementing your online class. What kind of training is going to be appropriate, by the way? And I think that this is one of the things that is more appropriate for an instructor, particularly a new instructor who now has limited or no experience with online course delivery or facilitating an online course. What kind of training does one need? It's very important to sit down and ascertain very honestly what you feel as an instructor you could benefit by in a way of further training from an instructional designer or somebody else, and how are you going to be able to get that training given, no doubt, your busy time schedule. We always should have a help option that is available both to students and instructors. Normally this is taken care of by an IT type help desk, instructional technology type help desk, or some other resource. But when you set up your course, and we'll get into this in more detail, always think in terms of where the student is going to get some kind of assistance from you or from somebody else in a technical domain. Where are you going to get assistance from? Management of resources and time. How much time are you going to allocate to grading and evaluating discussion boards? Again, this is one of those areas we want to get into in more detail, but part of an online class, a significant part of it, is an interaction, asynchronous and synchronous. So you might be using something like Blackboard Collaborate once a week to engage in synchronous communication, or you might be using, and you probably will be, discussion threads or wikis or blogs even. And those are typically asynchronous. But depending upon how much time that you think you're going to be able to spend legitimately and judiciously in the evaluation of what you are expecting of your students, you've got to factor that in during the implementation and design process. What's important also is the evaluation of your instructional effectiveness. And this, of course, is something that's going to be going on over time throughout, let's say, a typical semester. Formative evaluation, so that you are able to ascertain just how the course is doing, what the students are learning. Summative evaluation, the kinds of assessments and things that you're going to be providing your students all throughout the course in order to help them understand the content and materials much more deeply and more effectively. Here are some links to some instructional design models. We will try in the course of this presentation to make those links active for you. You can always stop this presentation, by the way. And I should mention that insofar as you have control over the presentation such as the one I'm providing, whether it be on YouTube or on Screencast, which is a server for Camtasia type products, one good thing about, at least one good thing about this mode of communication, even though it does tend to be at this point a little one way, and consequently you could put it in a domain of asynchronous on demand, you can stop it anytime you want. You can multitask, you can go back, you can rewind it, and consequently if I have a presentation, let's say, that's in excess of 10 or 15 minutes, sometimes the 10 or 15 minute limit is what instructional designers will tell you should do, particularly if you're doing a quote-unquote talking head type presentation. But if you're not, and you go a little bit longer, you can always index with a table of contents the basic materials. Have your end user go to the specific area that they feel that they want to go to very easily, very quickly. And you're going to have some kind of a control mechanism that allows a student or you to go back and review and stop it. So even if your presentation does tend to be a little bit long or long-winded, as this one indeed may seem to be, it can always be stopped. That does give the end user a significant amount of control over the flow and over what he or she needs to do in order to be able to understand and review more thoroughly what it is that's being presented. This is an example of a slightly different model, and I'm simply throwing it up here to give you the idea that you can get as detailed and complex at one level or as short and sweet at another level. The Addie model is generally considered to be short and sweet, but obviously within the various categories that are utilized in the Addie model, you can go into much more detail by expanding on each of the components, such as analysis and design. This particular model could actually be fitted into the Addie model relatively easily. It just tends to go on in a little bit more detail, a little bit different flow, and I think that when you adopt a model like this, it has a tendency to be better suited to the production line or production model view of online learning, as opposed to the Addie model, which could be incorporated into that idea, but is probably more suitable to the individual instructor who is working on his or her own material, possibly with the assistance of an instructional designer, but not necessarily a large team of instructional producers. Why would any of this be important? We definitely have arrived at something called the information age. Some years ago it was referred to. It's a digital age. People are using their technological devices to acquire information. This is happening with all ages, all age groups. There is, unfortunately, something still called the digital divide, the digital haves and have-nots. A good deal of the world is still not able to become involved as thoroughly online with digital learning as those of us in first world nations in the West and are able to do. And rightly or wrongly, we do tend to believe that over time more of the population of the world is going to be globally involved in online learning. There's some evidence that that has taken place with the edX, MIT, Harvard University joint effort produced ultimately by Coursera, where some of the courses have hundreds of students in them. How that's going to work out, I can't really make the prediction. I am aware to some extent of how the mechanics of actually running a course like that are, again, in the design process, have to be taken very deeply into consideration early on before you begin to run a course like that for the rest of the world. And so probably for now it's best to focus on your target audience, focus on the idea that the people that you're going to be communicating with and presenting your course to do have some digital inclination, so to speak. They may not be digital natives, but digital natives and also digital immigrants will encounter some of the similar technological problems that that any user would, and you have to prepare yourself to be able to deal with not only that, but also the fact that it's pretty much going to be here to stay. There will be some modification. of how it is that we're going to be able to run our courses in the digital age. And to some extent, that's going to depend upon the accessibility to or access to devices such as iPads and other things. We live in a world where you get tons and tons of information, a barrage of it. And people that are simply starting out in high school, they get grants for iPads. Many of those learners are going to be coming to your classroom, and they will have, and I'm going to parenthetically inject, rightly or wrongly, they will have the expectation that if they're in an online class, there are going to be some materials that the instructor is going to be providing that will become available to them in the manner in which they've grown accustomed. And doesn't mean that anybody has to cave in entirely to those demands if they think it somehow threatens or imperils the integrity of the subject matter they're choosing. But if you have elected to become 100% online or hybrid teacher, you have to take those things into consideration to a large extent. We want to try to match the teaching with the learner the best we can, and of course we've often heard of this notion of learner-centered approach. Now, this does not mean that an instructor should give up giving good lectures. I personally have benefited enormously from a dynamic or interesting lecturer, and I believe many other people have too. There are companies out there that actually, such as the audiobooks company, the great teaching company, where you might subscribe to a podcast, you might just simply listen, you might see some kind of a video presentation. Perhaps it's very talking headish, and perhaps at that level it doesn't seem like it's quote-unquote learner-centered. But I think that it can still be learner-centered, and that the instructor can still be a very, very good and interesting talking head, and that those two components can in fact be combined. With online learning, the virtual classroom is really limited to some extent by the learning management system and what the options and flexibility is that's being offered in such a system. But even if it's a face-to-face class, you are going to encounter iPads, you're going to encounter phones, you're probably going to encounter clickers. You may want to try to incorporate clickers into your PowerPoint presentations that you're giving to your students. In a rich online virtual classroom, in many ways, you are unlimited in the amount of material that you can bring in. It can be overwhelming. It could get us into that notion of information overload. That's why a person should be as judicious and careful as possible in selecting materials for that technologically rich classroom, so that the richness does not interfere with the experience of the students or with the attainment, so to speak, of the SLOs. Hybrid classrooms is something that I would like to discuss with people on a separate occasion. Hybrid classroom, I think, has turned out to be, up until perhaps recently, but I think it may still be true, perhaps the best of all worlds. Where you have a situation in which you have classes, let's say you've decided you want to meet a couple of times or 4 times or some magic number, I don't think there is one, but 4 times a semester. Maybe during which time you actually administer some of the examinations and quizzes and thus solve part of the problem, what many people complain about with respect to learner or test taker identity in cyberspace. There are ways of compensating for our ignorance about who the real test taker is in a virtual classroom, but the better guarantee is when you have a proctored face-to-face type exam. So a hybrid environment is very well suited to that need. Plus, I think it's very efficient to ask and answer questions, important questions, in a synchronous format of the kind in which you're going to experience in a face-to-face environment. So if you have a smattering of face-to-face options where students are required to come again to take tests or to get familiar with their colleagues, their comrades, their fellow students, and you can do an abundance of learning in your online setting, but you can also kind of tie up some loose ends during those face-to-face options. Sometimes the online the erstwhile online learner does not particularly favor the idea of having to drive physically or take some mode of transport to a class. I've seen resentment there, and maybe the hybrid setting isn't for that particular student or the instructor. But there's many, many benefits to be gained from hybrid classroom situations. But still, there are wonderful benefits to be gained by offering synchronous virtual classroom experiences to your students on a consistent and regular basis as well. This